It's the Kyle Hyman Show on Redeemer Radio.
This is Kyle Hyman, and joining us is the op-ed editor of the New York Post, contributing editor of the Catholic Herald, and he's here to share a little bit of his story of conversion to Catholicism. Joining us is Sohrab Ahmari. Thanks for being here, Sohrab.
Thanks for having me.
Were you and your family religious growing up?
No, not really. As I recount in my memoir, From Fire by Water, My Journey to the Catholic Faith, which is just out from Ignatius Press, I grew up in a very secular, humanistic kind of background, in the sense that although we were living in post-revolutionary Iran, which meant that we were surrounded by a country that had decided through a revolution to re-Islamize itself after the Shah's too secular, too liberal regime, we in our home, behind closed doors, my parents surrounded me with Western books and music and ideas. So there was this great clash between the outside world, which was definitely an Islamic theocracy, a new-founded Islamic theocracy, and what happened inside, which was that, my grandparents were, I think, believing Muslims, but even they were at peace with the occasional glass of wine. But my parents were, absolutely secular. My mother was a sort of spiritual seeker. She was one week like Buddhism, the next week she was into fortune telling, and a little bit of Christianity, a little bit of that, but none of it taken too seriously.
And so what did you make of all of that growing up? Were you a little confused, or did you think it was all kind of crazy, or what were your thoughts?
In some sense, when I was very young, I had a sense of Almighty God, and I would pray in the way that children play. I wasn't sure to which God, but I was certainly praying from my parents to get me that Lego set that I wanted and so forth. But by the time I was 13 years old, I had concluded that there is no God, and I became an atheist. And the reason for that was that God, as I encountered him under the Islamic Republic, was a God that I wanted nothing to do with, because he was a God who was purely law and political dominion. But there's no reason in him. There's no reasoning with him. There was no grace. There's no love. And he needed a police state to enforce his whims. And by the way, although he needed a police state to enforce his whims, the agents of that police state were so often pliable with bribery. I mean, I'll tell you, many people think, if you get caught with alcohol in Iran, you'll get flogged. Or if you are a man and a woman and you hold hands in public and you get caught, you'll get flogged, which is true, technically speaking. But often enough, if you have these kinds of encounters with what's called the morality police or the morality committee, you can bribe your way out of trouble. Like, you could just say, hey, all right, man, I'm sorry, but, here's $100, and the guy will go away. So that the hypocrisies that were demanded and the double life and the double thinking that were demanded in that kind of a society repelled me. So 13, 14, I said, there's no God.
So at what point do things start to change? Your perception of God starts to change, or what are some of the things that affected you in your faith?
It was a long-term process. I moved to the U.S. with my mother at age 14, and I almost instantly picked up my rebellion against God and authority that I had left back in the old country. I picked it up here because America, unlike what I had thought, was not as secular and hedonistic. Maybe the elite culture was, but I moved to Utah, and Utah was, in some ways a profoundly religious place, and very communitarian and conservative culturally. And so I turned to, Nietzsche and Marx, and I became a Marxist by the time I was an undergrad in college, which, by the way, is not untypical or atypical for someone my age. So my story, although it's exotic in some ways it's very, I think, universal. The way things began to change was really real life woke me up in some ways. I mean, I became a school teacher after I finished my undergrad years, and the sheer fact of being responsible for other people's children, it forces you to get real about life in some ways. So that helped a lot. I would also just among my fellow teachers and in myself, and I would see that there are eternal truths about the way people tick, that there are things that no matter where people are, you can detect people who are virtuous, you can detect your own failings, and there's this voice inside you who seems to already know what's right and wrong in some ways. And that voice, which is basically the conscience, I began to question where it came from. You know, that there's this source of an objective morality inside you. I after a while, with lots of reading and thinking and life experience, made me think that that's the imprint of a supreme being who has created a moral order. And then I had a couple of providential encounters with the Mass in my early 20s. You know, like many people in their early 20s, there was time where I would overdo it with like the drinking, or just somehow or other feel like I've let myself down, or I have not lived up to my sort of full dignity as I thought about it. And on a couple of occasions in these kind of moments of relative personal crisis, I would go to Mass, and I couldn't tell you exactly why. I mean, one instance, I was just circling around Manhattan, thinking about, what a lousy, disastrous weekend it had been, around Penn Station, and there's a Capuchin monastery not far away. So on one occasion, I just walked in as the Sunday evening Mass was about to begin, and I was floored by that experience.
What about it? Because I think a lot of people, their first experience of the Mass would be that it's boring compared to maybe the way other religions celebrate their faith, and especially like a Protestant church that has a big production or something like that. What floored you about the Catholic Mass?
I think the words of institution. First of all, the sheer silence of the place, the serenity of the place, surrounded by the commotion of Midtown Manhattan was precisely what I needed at that point. But, when the priest says on the night when he was about to be betrayed, this idea of a redemptive self-sacrifice unto death it stirred my soul. And, even in my childhood in Iran, the aspect of the Shiite faith that I always found moving was this idea of the Shiite saints who would lay down their lives for their truth and for their friends. In this case, obviously, I knew enough to know that it's God who lays down his life. And, when the priest held up a little disc, which I didn't even know was bread, I felt that there was something very holy in the face of which I was so abject and pathetic, and shouldn't even be showing my face in before this holy thing that's radiating from the altar, and yet it radiates also for me. So, but it took much longer after those encounters for me to finally become a Catholic. In the meanwhile, I read Pope Benedict's books. I finally properly read the Bible, and that finally convinced me on the intellectual side. But before the intellectual side, my emotions and my imagination had been sort of persuaded and attracted.
We're talking with Sohrab Ahmari. His memoir is From Fire by Water. And you talked about you're being floored by the Mass. You're getting into some spiritual reading. And what comes next? Are you instantly converted, or is it a long, drawn-out process? Or what is your journey from your first experience of the Mass to becoming Catholic?
Yeah, it took another 8 years or so.
Okay.
But in the meanwhile, I was reading a book, and the way I spoke about religious, especially Christian faith, changed. I used to be obviously so disdainful, and I began to say things to this effect to my friends. I would say, I don't believe this stuff, but it's really beautiful, isn't it? Or I don't believe this stuff, but it's been a civilizing force, hasn't it? Sure. But internally, what I couldn't, I was essentially restaging St. Peter's three denials several times a week, because internally I had believed that this is good, this is what I want, but I was too sort of intellectually arrogant to say so, so I was betraying the Lord several times a week. But finally, I was in London, I was working for the Wall Street Journal at the time, and I had been flirting with evangelical Christianity. So I would go to evangelical churches, partly because although my whole Christian sensibility had been formed by the Mass, had been touched by the Mass, I had been reading Pope Benedict, it was still the evangelicals who asked you to come to Sunday service with them. So I was going. But on my way the church that I used to attend in London, the evangelical one, is right next to a Catholic church called the London Oratory, which is famous for its very sort of traditional liturgy. It's a magnificent Baroque church. And I walked in one time after evangelical Sunday service, and it reactivated all those experiences I'd had with the Mass all those years earlier. But this time around, I just said, I want this. So I went to what's called the Oratory House, which is where the priests live. I knocked on the door, and this wizened old priest opened the door, and I just said, in a very posh English accent, he said, yes, how may I help you? And I said, I wish to become a Roman Catholic, and he just didn't miss a beat. He said, very well, I shall instruct you.
That's awesome. So what do you think made your experience with the Mass and reading Catholic writers had such an impact on you when so many millions of people go to the Catholic Mass and it seems to have no impact on their spirituality? They just are either lukewarm Catholics or they don't become Catholics. We got so many people that go to Mass to appease somebody else, a spouse or a parent, and never become Catholic. Why do you think you were affected by it when others aren't?
I mean, there's always an element of grace in the sense that I can't say it was purely a discovery on my part, and therefore I sort of achieved something that others can't. In faith is made possible by divine grace. So that's certainly a factor. And so in all cases, I would encourage prayer. But I would also encourage this is for even those who attend Mass because they feel obligated, because grandma says so, or because your husband or wife wants you to go. I think that if with an open enough heart, what's happening in the supernatural action of the Mass, this astonishing thing where the creator of the universe presents himself to you under the appearance of bread and wine, and the sacrifice, in a sense, is not renewed, but we gain access to the sacrifice at Calvary one more time. All this is so beautiful and speaks to the heart in ways that even the mind may not be prepared to. You never know those people attending whether they're being touched in some way, but maybe they're not even willing to admit it to themselves.
Yeah. What has changed the most in your life since becoming Catholic?
I would feel a lot more guilty than even I did beforehand.
Okay.
So the conscience has become an even more acute force. But no, in all seriousness, I found just a tremendous sense of order, because although our faith is about grace, it's also about order. That's the way that the church thinks about the world in this sort of long-term, millennial way, and the way that the church thinks about political order, the way that it thinks about cultural order as against our own present disorders in the West. It gives me peace and a sort of confidence that as I navigate the world as a new father, and I'm surrounded by, in some ways, a very degraded liberal culture, that there is this bulwark, of the West, which is the Roman Catholic Church. That's it.
Yeah. All right. Well, again, the book is called From Fire by Water, My Journey to the Catholic Faith. It's available through Ignatius Press, Amazon, wherever you get your books. Check it out. Thank you so much, Sohrab, for joining us. I appreciate it.
Hey, thanks, Kyle.